The Redbird Reboot Podcast. Are you ready to get rebooted, Cardinals fans? He settles down, at least in the zone, and does not stop running.
Blake Murphy.
This is the identity for the Arizona Cardinals.
The run defense is just horrendous, and it's been horrendous for the Cardinals for a long time.
And Marcos Labrada.
He's going to bring over his philosophy. It should make it better.
Present the hottest NFL podcast from the country's hottest state.
He should be turning around the logo.
Actually, some breaking news we can cover here. This popped up just about, 6 minutes ago.
It's Redbird Reboot.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans. Welcome in. It's the Redbird Reboot Podcast. I'm at Blake Murphy 7. We've got at Pancakesel Marcos Labrada joining on the go. As Marcos is actually, you can see from the background, in a hotel room. Lighting's a little different than normal, but always love when we're able to get to talk Arizona Cardinals football for you, and he would not be denied after this week of free agency. Marcos, how are you doing? And Cardinals fans, at least everywhere, are probably pretty glad, as are you, I know, of some of these free agent signings we'll get to dive into here in a moment.
I'm so glad we can finally talk about like the signings and the fact that this off season, we're actually becoming more like aggressive when it comes to free agency. We've been used to, even in the last year Keim's regime, which Keim was known for at least getting one or two big signs during the offseason, just like passing up free agent after free agent, watching talent walk out the building, people that we wish we would have retained, like a la Hassan Reddick back in 2020. So in this circumstance, I'm really happy about the fact that not only were we aggressive from the very start, but we continued to go. Yes, there was a little bit of a dead period. That's okay, but nothing right now is indicating that they didn't do everything they could to try to get as much talent as they can.
Right. Obviously, at least we'll kick off with some of this. The Combine is another thing we'll be able to talk about. We'll probably have another future show that delves a little bit more in-depth. We'll talk about that at the end. Let's kick it off at least with probably the first couple of signings that we had to begin free agency. And these are going to be a little bit more, I guess, boring is the way to be able to think about it. We're going to be looking a lot at some of these guys in Aaron Brewer and Joey Blunt. Core special teams players, Marcos. Like, one of the things that we figured was as long as Aaron Brewer was healthy and wanted to keep playing, he would likely keep playing. Something at least that he's one of the longest tenured Cardinals that we've seen, and Joey Blunt was a good special teams player last season. Didn't find as many snaps onto the field, but overall he did a pretty good job when it came to just getting downfield on coverage, on kicks. I believe there was at least one turnover that he was a part of with forcing. And these are just the small moves that you'll make with a deadline in tow. I don't know if there's even that much we can talk about for some of them. I think the bigger move that we can at least say is the Arizona Cardinals making their move in terms of keeping Baron Browning, not just with a 1-year deal, but a 2-year contract. And this is the guy they traded for instead of Azeez Ojulari for a 6th-round pick. They do bring him back. And this is a guy that a lot of teams ultimately didn't view as a starter. He did flash at times for the Cardinals. It doesn't seem like he's going to be a guy who you're going to say is the answer. But when you talk about a rotation of a run stuffer like Zaven Collins, getting a healthy BJ Ojulari back, probably drafting another guy, maybe you're going to go in on a veteran edge rusher at some point. He just is a good name to put into the mix considering how rough the edge rusher spot was last year, even with Dennis Gardeck healthy. And I think ultimately this is a move that we probably expected that the Cardinals could be able to make. They get it wrapped up before free agency officially starts.
Yeah, this at first I wasn't so excited about like making the acquisition during the midseason training deadline. But I am happy about the fact that I've heard nothing but good things from Baron Browning. I don't know if people are very aware of the channel That's Good Sports by I believe his name is Perna. I forgot what his first name was. But does a great show and whatnot. Big Broncos fan. And when he was going over like the review of this, and he talked about Baron Browning, he said, "Please take care of him Like, I wish we could have kept them in that 3 outside linebacker rotation of young guys that has Jonathan Cooper and Nick Benito, and they thought Baron Brownie was going to be the third rotational guy that shows huge upside. But the problem, of course, is he is very injured. He's injury prone, and he's riddled with them throughout his career. So the one thing that is holding him back, and obviously there's a rumor out there that he was having a nagging injury, so maybe he didn't play to his fullest potential. But he does have great upside. I've seen him on film. I am impressed in what he does in the limited amount of snaps. So this one to me is a no-brainer, and I'm happy about bringing him back.
Yeah, with Baron Browning, you take a look at him last year, and what we see from him was ultimately that he didn't have the highest defensive grade, but as far as pass rushers went, that was his best season came in 2023. As far as pass rushing grading out, he finished 35th that year out of 112 eligible players, which when you're talking about that means essentially you are a first-team starter for a defense in the NFL. Like you said, with health, he isn't a former Ohio State Buckeye. That's something that we've seen the Cardinals seem to like those players. And when you're talking about what was some of the value he brought to the Cardinals last year, it was juice in the pass rushing game. So last year, the top 2 pass rushing grades went to Starling Thomas and Keitrell Clark. And you're like, okay, those are cornerbacks. So that means that they were having to blitz. So you're not talking about an every down edge rusher, every down type of guy who's going to be there. These are going to be the guys who ultimately did not spend a lot of snaps getting to the quarterback. The guy who did have the highest PFF grade in that spot was Baron Browning, followed by their other acquisitions that we'll get to here in just a second. But the Cardinals really went out in terms of being able to improve some of what was their biggest weakness last year in getting to the quarterback. So I think with Browning, the upside at least is still there. And as we've talked about, he is, I believe, only 26 years old, still obviously going to be entering that prime age of 26 to maybe 32 is going to be what we're seeing with some guys can play a little longer who get to that star level. But that was probably the first ones that wrapped up when it came to free agency. There's a couple of other moves that were made pretty much from the start of free agency. So Calvin Beachum and Evan Brown both are back with essentially 1 year, and for Evan Brown, a 2-year deal to the Cardinals. Brown was a pretty stellar part of that left guard spot, while Calvin Beachum, as we all saw last year against the Bills and Von Miller, he struggled. We're like, oh, this is going to be rough for our offense last year. And the Cardinals had probably their best offensive stretch of the season when he was starting at that right tackle spot. He did end up replacing Jonah Williams after Williams was hurt and went to the bench for the rest of the season to kind of finish up that injury that he had a bit of a setback from, a new injury. Either way, he's going to be back here at good old, I think it's 37, 38 years old is what he's going to be turning this year. And it's one of those valuable signings. Like when we think about the Cardinals and guys that they signed back in 2019 and 2020, you thought he was going to be a 1-year guy here. He's continued to have some of those. And I think it's actually 36 he's turning this year, actually. So I had a 1 year older is what I had. But again, solid pieces you're going to be able to add back. The biggest one, of course, being Brown on a 2-year deal. He can play center, can play left guard, he can play right guard. It wouldn't shock me, Marcos, if we get to a spot where Evan Brown is the starter at left guard, or he switches to right guard. They could still bring in another potential guard at some point, whether through free agency, through the draft. I don't think this is the sort of team that would make a trade for a type of starting guard unless they really are able to do a day 3 sort of pick swap to bring someone who they like better in. Seems like this is kind of going to be what they have set for the Cardinals. Another couple of guys returning. We'll do it quickly. Zay Jones on a 1-year deal, as well as LJ Collier coming back up. These are deals where essentially you see if they can make it through camp. They have been in valuable spots for the most part. LJ Collier especially last year was at a pretty good finish to the season overall. When you're taking a look at the Arizona Cardinals and how their team structure as far as with their overall defensive presence and offensive presence, we really didn't get to see the best from an LJ Collier. They finished pretty low in terms of their defensive line overall rankings. On the offensive side, what we did get to see was that there were similar spots with the likes of a Calvin Beachum. He was trending higher than a lot of the other players, but overall you're talking about bringing in a person who is at least a net positive or net average They are replaced. They're not irreplaceable, but they're not quite at that replaceable level. Overall, these are some solid moves, I think, for Arizona, and it made a lot of fans honestly kind of ticked off, Marcos, because they had made one big move, which we'll get to in a second, and they hadn't made a lot of moves after that outside of re-signing their own guys, which got some people a little bit wondering if Monty Ossenfort, if they weren't willing to pay, was he just kind of too comfortable? Was he going to run it back? And then we got to kind of see some of the plan play out over time. But thoughts on some of the returning players. Do you think the Cardinals should have let any of these guys walk instead of bringing them back for another season?
Well, there's one player that we haven't talked about that I wish they would try to bring back. But for these players, the ones we just discussed, Evan Brown is the biggest like surprise for me. I didn't know he played there as a really solid left guard, and he could also just take that starting position for this next year. I know Trey Smith was like the big name, but Evan, you need somebody who's like stable at the position. They can and they're able to hold it down as a starter. And I believe that he can play those starter snaps. So I'm really glad about everybody being brought back that's on that list, because of the fact that you still need that stability. You need those backups. You need those starters. You need those players that are solid, and you need to fill up your roster with those type of players, because then it gives you more leniency on what to do in the draft. If you bring somebody like a rookie, you don't have to force them out to just be a starter and throw them to the wolves if they're not ready. And if they are ready, like let's just say you draft a tackle in the first round, not saying I would be for that, but let's just say if that was the case, you'd want someone like Helden Beecham on the roster as an example, because he can take that start position. So all these guys, depth piece, it is what it is. Every team does it. You need to bring good bodies, and you need to bring good familiar bodies into your building, because they help your team win.
Yeah, no, totally agree with that. Speaking of some of the bodies helping your team win, let's talk about the biggest offseason acquisition, the one the Cardinals did make and the one the Cardinals did not make. And the one that they did make, of course, was signing pass rusher Josh Sweat to the Arizona Cardinals, a 4-year contract, which had about, I believe it was about $41 million or so guaranteed, for grand total of about, I want to say, it can't be announced or signed by the team, about $19 million a year or so. This is one that, because it's the legal tampering period, the Cardinals were not necessarily able to talk about that as far as from the team account until it was there. But it's a 4-year, $76 million. When we talk about contracts, Marcos, the best way you can look at these sort of deals is it's really about the guaranteed money. So if he's signing at a total guarantee of $41 million a year, average of $19 million a year, technically speaking, you don't have anything guaranteed after your age 29 season, which means that technically it's a truly 2-year deal that you're locked into. And then after that, you can then move around money, be able to make some stuff will be guaranteed. It's just the way that NFL contracts work ultimately is that it's much closer to a year-to-year or multiple years league. The guys who get those big, long 4-year deals that have at least 3 years of guaranteed money, those guys are kind of already at that star level, being able to have that. And Sweat is one of those guys that when you talk about him instantly on the Arizona Cardinals, you can take a look at just like some of the grading system that they have here when it comes to pass rush. He has not played a down for the Arizona Cardinals, and yet he instantly would end up being one of their best defensive players in terms of pass rush. And outside of Garrett Williams and Zaven Collins with his run grade, he'd instantly be one of the best defensive players on the Cardinals, finished top 36 in terms of 119 edge rushers at that position. He was, of course, on a loaded Philly defensive line that had some other star players such as Jalen Carter, obviously Milton Williams, who goes to the Patriots. We'll talk a little bit about that one here in a second, because I know that he was a high priority free agent for the Cardinals to be able to get. And then you're talking also about other guys like Nolan Smith and the Eagles having to kind of keep some of their own guys around. Sweat's one of those guys they let walk and has been kind of hinted throughout the offseason. He was a guy that was very likely to get to Arizona. Part of that was the need for an edge rusher, and the other factor being that a lot of the team fits when it came to free agents out there. Jonathan Gannon had been the defensive coordinator for what Josh Sweat's best season had been in the NFL. I believe that was in the year 2022. that he was with the Philadelphia Eagles, and that was a 11.5, I think, sacks that he had on the season, officially, as far as that goes. So this is one of those spots where, oh yeah, it was 11 sacks, not 11.5, 11 sacks, including an interception back in 2022. That was, of course, the year the Eagles made their first Super Bowl with the Jalen Hurts and Jonathan Gannon against the Kansas City Chiefs. Getting that sort of reunion makes a lot of sense for Arizona, and it makes a lot of sense for the Cardinals to finally have kind of that Batman alpha sort of pass rusher. Maybe it's not going to be this superstar level pass rusher, talking about the blue chip difference maker player that you're looking at. But when it comes to NFL free agency, and we know what you have to pay in free agency is usually overpaying, it does feel like this fits something that the Cardinals needed to do, and something that, with how the team has not spent in free agency the past few years, something that we're glad that they did do, Marcos.
Yeah. Aside from the fact that he is a consistent guy, that's probably the thing that I like about him the most when it comes to his pass rush and whatnot. Like you said, he is the alpha. He immediately is our best pass rusher on this team, and he hasn't even taken a snap for us. So it's his body type is the prototypical outside linebacker, like the edge guy, like his build, his expertise, of course, which is like trying to win to the outside most of the time. Not too much of a well-known power rusher, but very solid against the run. He can hold his he could hold and shed blocks whenever if he gets picked off by, like, let's say a tight end that's like on the move, or maybe even a running back. You'd never want to put a running back on this guy, even if you have him for chip help. He tends to be able to handle those very well. So he is an impressive person. Not saying that he is what I would consider like the best type of person we could get at the position. Obviously, there's other names that were floated out there that are like actual, like, like all pro level type of outside linebackers. But considering how the market is, I mean, you can't complain about what you get with him, because of the fact that he showed out during the Super Bowl. He showed what he could do if he keeps working on his craft, especially under the coach that was able to unlock him. That sky's the limit with him.
Yeah, it's the idea of availability. Some guys, when you talk about for trade acquisition, like a Myles Garrett, not available. A guy like a Trey Hendrickson has apparently been available in trade. No team is ponied up for that yet. 30-year-old pass rusher. If the Bengals are looking for a haul, which, like, let's say that the Bengals are out there going, we want a first-round pick to replace this guy. Well, teams aren't going to give that, so we'll have to see even a second or third-round pick. DK Metcalf was traded for, I believe, a later pick, and then we saw even a quarterback in Geno Smith got traded for a third-round pick because there was a new contract needed. The thing that Josh Sweat brings ultimately is that he's going to bring a combination of athleticism and what I'd say is bendiness. So when you take a look at his profile coming out, this is kind of the mock draftable chart that goes with his combine scores. You're talking at least about someone who's got a high level of athleticism and explosiveness across the board coming out. Being able to see that high level of vertical jump at 265 pounds, being able to see that 40-yard dash that he had of, I believe it was 4.5. Yep, 4.5 at 260 is impressive. Having a great shuttle. The only thing, at least as far as with the weight, when you're talking about weight compared to other edge rushers, some edge rushers are going to be like, closer to 280. As far as depending on how you're going to fit as an edge rusher. Are you more of a defensive end? Are you more of a linebacker? Some guys are going to be quite a bit lighter as far as with 230, 250, as we've seen with the likes of Hassan Reddick. But at the end of the day, it's a place where if you're talking about something similar, Dallas Turner is the closest guy that's come out. And Dallas Turner was, by all accounts, probably the first or second best edge rusher in last year's draft class. With the one exception, of course, being, I believe it was the Rams. Young was the one that they had, at least for that one. It was, this is going to drive me crazy, at least Jared Verse, not Verse, Young. Jared Verse was the other great pass rusher coming out last year. So you're talking about if the Cardinals are able to, instead of having a draft pick that was spent on an edge rusher, you're bringing in this guy as a free agent. That does open up the ability for them to have a little flexibility with that 16th pick. And some of what I think we can also talk about is just the fact that this is a guy who the Cardinals are familiar with because they've played him a couple of times. This is going to be like a edge rush from Sweat coming off of the edge with a bendiness. You're also taking a look real quick, at least as far as with being able to get that rip move to get past. And Kyler Murray is actually able to get away in this game for the most part. DJ Humphries, you can see this kind of, we're able to pin him down. He continues and is able to make a play out of it. So you're talking about a guy who is going to be getting one-on-one situations in the edge rush, who is not a liability against the run, which is something that we've seen can happen before, and ultimately has a lot of that bendiness off of the edge. A pass rusher like a Dennis Gardeck is someone who we said is an effort guy who may or may not necessarily, get quite there when it comes to, when it comes to being the alpha pass rusher in the room. Another play that we have, at least it was from Tyler Drake, at least, who does work for Arizona Sports. This is again in the touchdown throw that Kyler made in that crazy play. I believe this was that throw to James Conner off of that back foot that everyone was just going crazy over when it became very clear the Cardinals and Jonathan Gannon were about to beat the Eagles, which in hindsight has now become one of the more impressive wins, given that the Eagles did go on to win the Super Bowl the following year with a lot of the same players and talent, just needed to move on from Matt Patricia. Very interesting to be able to at least see some of that quickness, some of that burst. You can see here clearly he's getting up in the when I talk about being able to have that pocket for a quarterback, he's getting upfield, but also has a lot of that bend. And you can even see when he kind of tucks back in, there's ankle flexibility. So these are areas where when we talk about like the higher end sort of edge rushers, guys who can get double digit sacks, this is one of the players who's capable of this that we have not had in Arizona in a couple of years. We've been able to see a Chandler Jones type who has been a pretty much, if not Hall of Famer, because I don't think he'll quite be up there, but at least for sure Ring of Honor caliber player. This is the closest thing to that the Cardinals have gotten in quite a bit of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are two impressive wins on the outside. That's one of the things that, because he was built in a lab, so he can beat you with speed to the outside. He has the 6'5" frame with the long arms and whatnot. So that's the advantage you get from being able to win outside. His problem is trying to win back inside because he cannot take a double team because mostly it's because of his size. Not saying he's not powerful. He's just tall. He has long arms. He's more built for the outside pass rush. I mean, he was complaining about like missing tackles or sacks to Kyler Murray. Well, those are it right there. Those are the ones he was talking about. He kind of like talked about like that it haunted him. He kept thinking, oh man, I had those 2 missed sacks, and it was in the back of his mind. But that's how competitive he is. So he obviously said that he won't have the chance to do it anymore because he's on the same team. But hey, like I mentioned, those highlights are very impressive. His film is very impressive, and I can't wait to see him in the Cardinals jersey.
Absolutely. No, the other one that we'll have, at least, it's kind of was a little bit of a pause for the most part. I know some fans were getting a bit antsy. Quite a few defensive tackles came off of the board. Cardinals do end up getting one of the guys that was one of the better players overall in terms of pass rush win rate last year in Dalvin Tomlinson. So we talk about like in a snap, at least it's a reference to his sack celebration, which we'll be able to see in just a moment. But this was a guy at 31 years of age, signs a 2-year deal, and kind of gives us a good clue into what are the type of deals Monty Ossenfort is looking to bring in for players. So we talk about Josh Sweat. That's going to be the first day of free agency, first 4-year deal in a couple of years. There's been a couple of guys that they have signed previously to some of those longer deals. I think that there's Jordan Hicks was one, at least, when he had signed a contract with the Arizona Cardinals. I believe that was a 4-year deal. They had signed other guys like Mike Iupati to a 4-year deal. Also, one of their prime free agents in Justin Pugh, they signed to a 4-year deal. These are all like first day free agency, big splashes, big money you're having to commit. What we've seen with Monty is he doesn't like necessarily the 3-year, maybe almost 4-year for this 30-plus-year-old type of player. But he does seem to like the option of getting guys for multiple years. We can see that with guys like last year, Bilal Nichols, Justin Jones, they signed to essentially 2 to 3 year deals in free agency, but they were guys who were 26, 27 years old. We take a look at some of the guys this year who he signed. We're talking about Josh Sweat, is 28 years old. You take a look at Dalvin Tomlinson. It doesn't have that third year attached, but he does have that 2-year deal that he's able to be signed on for. And honestly, the more that you watch Dalvin Tomlinson, the easier it gets to be able to really enjoy some of the tape that he put up last year with the Cleveland Browns. He had Myles Garrett, of course, being one of the better pass rushers, if not like the best pass rusher in the league. But there's still a lot to really like about Dalvin Tomlinson. When you take a look at him coming out of Alabama a few years ago, he was a guy that at the defensive tackle position, or even comparing to the rest of the interior defensive line, you're not talking about a height, weight, speed freak for the position, but you're also talking about a guy at least who at the, I think it was 310 pounds, is going to be above average in pretty much every single percentile except for the straight 40-yard dash. The other thing that's really unique about him, as far as with the weight, arm length, and some of that other size, is that it took him a few years to really get going, essentially. That's something that I think is really unique when it comes to someone like a Dalvin Tomlinson. I'm going to go ahead and find some highlights that I had here, at least, of him, but I believe it's also from Tyler Drake, was going over some of these as far as looking at the film from last year. And this is a play, I believe, of the, unfortunately, one time the Arizona Cardinals fans got to see Clayton Tune play. If you're looking for Tomlinson, he's actually going to be lined up over here on Paris Johnson with, I believe that 61 is going to be the other backup guy that they had that year at right guard who got replaced. This is obviously the last game before Kyler came back. But you'll be able to at least see kind of is able to move an outside-inside move, goes and lands down on top of him, and then puts up the infinity gauntlet. So very much when they're talking about a snap, everyone's very familiar, at least, with the strength of the Marvel movies character. And then you have another play from that against Dak Prescott in this play. You can kind of talk about interior pass rush being one of the biggest things that the NFL really wanted to have this year. And a reason that you can see all of this, no less than Milton Williams signing a 4-year, $104 million deal, talking $26 million a year for a guy who played probably about, I'm going to say 40 to 50% of the snaps and rotating in. He still ended up, for that regard, Marcos, was a freak whenever he was on the field, was a huge part of that Super Bowl. But at the end of the day, you're still talking about paying essentially almost like mid-tier quarterback money for a guy who had never really played more than the 50% of the snaps. You're expecting that number of snaps to go up. Cardinals, from what I would heard through, and this is kind of like back channels through different people, different fans, whatever you want to kind of call it. Everyone says sometimes sources are there. Cardinals were looking at anywhere between 21 to 23 million a year, and the Patriots and the rest of the market with them and the Vikings, who signed a couple of guys, they ended up making the price go way up. It went out of the Cardinals range, and Milton ended up getting that extra, probably about $4 or $5 million a year, pushing him up from being that 4-year deal for about $20 million to about $26 million. So you're talking about a difference of $80 million to $100 million. That was about a $20 million more than I think not only the Cardinals probably would have been able to pay, but also probably that they wanted to pay. That's something that the Patriots, having the most cap room in the NFL, were very aggressive. I think when you're talking about, a lot of people were disappointed when the Cardinals didn't get Milton Williams. They saw Josh Sweat come in. But at the end of the day, when you're talking about getting someone who's got a really good motor up front, who's been able to like stack and shed and getting pressure on the quarterback from the front, getting some pressure off of the edge when it comes to the likes of Josh Sweat, suddenly you can kind of see, hey, you got Darius Robinson coming in for a full year. Could the Cardinals draft another edge rusher, maybe even another defensive tackle at pick 16? That may be enough to be able to push Arizona's defense in its weakest spot in the front seven into a huge strength, Marcos.
Yeah, of course, because we have the young guy, Darius Robinson, that we haven't been able to see all year playing that defensive end position. Dalvin Tomlinson immediately raises that. He raises the level that they're at and kind of like is able to bring it up just a tad bit, because then you have a rotation between him, Bilal Nichols, and Justin Jones. And I know people are down on Bilal Nichols and Justin Jones. To me, I never thought about him as penetrators, mostly just people who are good against the run, or at least they're fairly fairly good against the run. And this year they didn't hold out. But now that you have them as a rotation, you put these guys more on the bench. You have Dalvin Tomlinson, who has a track record of being like a person who can be good against the run, but he's mostly known as a penetrator, as you can see. That's always a good thing to have in your line, especially when it's up the middle. Now, is he a true nose tackle? I don't really see him as a
Yeah, I don't
actual
see him as a
nose tackle.
nose. I think he's more of that three technique type, which if you're looking for a comparison, you're talking more about the Aaron Donald. He'll line up against the guards versus the center. I think that's the easy way to think of it.
Yeah, that's what I would see him just taking on guards most of the time, and especially not trying to get that double team by the center and the guard. But if he does get that double team by the center and the guard, that's when you talk about what these run fits where the linebackers are able to make plays, either blitzing over, in the A or B gaps, or trying to fill in their run fit to be able to stop the run.
Yep, no, that's one of the places where, as we saw with the Cardinals last year, they really did need some help in terms of just being able to have those type of run stuffers who could stay healthy, who were able to stay available. And when you're talking about that, it wasn't that the Cardinals had none of those guys. Like, it was just that the guy that they did have, who was probably their best player at it from that nose tackle position, was Dante Stills. And that was the one spot where we talk about, hey, if Dante Stills is a seventh round pick who is essentially second on your team in sacks, that's not something that of how you're normally going to build your team. Usually what you're going to do is you're going to be able to have those guys who can be a late round gem that are able to be a piece of that puzzle, but it's going to be ultimately remembering that teams are going to be pulling in the best athletes going up against the other best athletes in the world. Technique is important. What the Cardinals really didn't have over the last few years was a guys who could stay on the field and stay healthy. Bilal Nichols was one of the guys who, when coming in, he had been incredibly healthy for the the Oakland Raiders before he came in, and he just was not able to at least stay on. It was kind of like the Cardinals were a little bit cursed. You talk about back in 2018, 2019, as far as with his career grades off of the defensive line. His availability kind of dwindled after a good start with his rookie season. And then last year, he just got hurt, wasn't able to stay on the field. Same story goes for a Justin Jones, who really did struggle a bit that year as well. That's something that the Cardinals are not going to forget about these guys because they did sign them. They're essentially entering the second year of these 3-year deals. They want to see what they have in them. If these are guys who they go back, they've recovered from injury, and like you said, you're talking about getting an actual rotation of guys versus, all right, we're putting Dante Stills out there, we've got a Roy Lopez out there, guys who you've been able to pluck off the scrap heap who are productive, forcing sacks, being able to force fumbles. Then you're going to see, can these guys be able to step in and, like you said, be able to be solid against the run? Speaking of Roy Lopez, he does head off to the Detroit Lions. That was something that I think the Cardinals knew was going to happen because they decided, instead of bringing back a Roy Lopez and having to essentially pay him a bit more than maybe he would have gotten as far as snaps on this team, he gets a better opportunity with the Lions since they'll be playing Jones and Nichols. You also can see Dalvin Tomlinson come in, and now you get to actually have Dante Stills, Dalvin, and whatever sort of draft pick they would have are now the primary interior disruptors for the Arizona Cardinals. As far as for guys who are departing in terms of free agency for the Arizona Cardinals, there's not as many guys who at least have departed or changed teams overall who have really gotten a home yet besides the likes of Roy Lopez. Some guys that we had wondered if they would find a home were the likes of a Christian Kirk. There are other guys at least we can talk about, and a Kaiser White has not necessarily found a home yet. There's not as many former Cardinals who are on the market who have actually signed with a team. And that, to me, Marcos, says that this is probably a Cardinals team that did a good job of keeping their own guys and is still going to be moving forward with being able to add some additional players. Let's talk about the last and most important, in my opinion, position for those who want to talk about hot takes and all of the other stuff that goes on there. We're going to talk a little bit about Jacoby Brissett, who the Arizona Cardinals bring in after trying to get him since 2023. This is a guy who is a pro at being a backup quarterback. He has ultimately Then a guy who's gotten some starting spots in the league. Cardinals fans were able to remember he got drafted originally by the New England Patriots. And he's a guy that made a lot of sense. He played under Drew Petzing in the Cleveland Browns offense. He has not just the height and the ability to take hits at the quarterback position, but he's got a bit of athleticism. He's also a much better passer overall than a Josh Dobbs, but not high enough quality of a passer where he'll really be a threat to Kyler Murray's position. For example, like if you were signing a Daniel Jones in the offseason, given Jones's caliber of where he was drafted in that draft class, maybe there'd be some room for controversy. Some people will probably put controversy out of this, but at the end of the day, it felt like this is the Cardinals when they had Cliff Kingsbury, wanted Case Keenum, couldn't get Case Keenum. They finally were able to get Colt McCoy to be their backup after a year. Similar situation, at least here, except this time they actually do go out and get that target in a Jacoby Brissett. And for what we've seen as far as of him being able to ultimately operate, this is something that is really unique to be able to see in the Cardinals have a guy who knows their system, knows their scheme, and is able to execute it ultimately at a high level. You can win games if Jacoby Brissett is your starter, something we have not seen the Cardinals been able to do without Kyler Murray over the past couple of years.
That was a first kind of weird highlight there. He handed the ball off, but I think what he was trying to talk about with the fundamentals is it says right here 4-minute drill when there's burn the clock being a safety net. In case, well, I mean, he's going to do what he's going to be asked to do. If he's going to hand off the ball and just run the clock down, I mean, that's what he's going to do. But I really love the signing of Jacoby Brissett, mostly because of the fact that he is not only a high-end backup. We have talked about maybe wanting to sign him during the offseason. Just like you said, a Colt McCoy type of person that's going to go out there. He's going to win a couple of games. He obviously isn't going to be the person who you're going to have as a starter. Not going to be the big competition, but as people will say, you know, he brings in leadership and whatnot. So this signing is one of my favorite signings, probably my second favorite behind, well, Dalvin Thompson. I would say he's up at the same level because you do need that high-end backup that has good leadership and has good experience in the league.
No, there's no doubt about it. This is one of those places where when we talk about the Cardinals' backup quarterbacks going into this next year with Clayton Tune, I think it's a big year for Clayton Tune. I think it takes a piece off of the board for Arizona of having to spend a pick on quarterback. They still do like Clayton Tune. If you're going to take a guy very, very late in the draft to kind of push Tune a little bit or see if you want to shovel it to the bottom, or I don't think that that's even going to be something for consideration. This is going to be a Kyler Murray is the guy, Jacoby Brissett's the backup. We like what we've seen from Clayton Tune, and he's going to be our backup to the backup who knows the system, that has some of the upside that's there. It's a spot, at least, Marcos, where you're just getting in good players, and it is a 2-year deal where he signs for $12 million. A little bit pricier to bring in, for example, you're talking about a little bit higher-end backup than just who they had the last couple of years. Last year, obviously, the Cardinals had, I want to say at least Desmond Ridder, who lost the backup job to Clayton Tune, and that was something where you're then paying Tune hundreds of thousands of dollars versus millions of dollars. This just shows, I think, the commitment this year is that the Cardinals, they're not going to be going into this season with an expectation of, hey, if we end up winning games and have a shot for the playoffs, great. This is a playoffs or bust type of situation, a very critical season overall. There's one other name that we have to be able to at least shout out before we at least move on to talking about the other main signing, and that's going to be Greg Dortch with an RFA tender offer. He's likely to come back, which I don't think it was a surprise to many people. RFA tenders and restricted free agent can happen when you are a undrafted free agent. That's one of the things that I think is very unique when it comes to Greg Dortch and guys who don't get drafted is you can kind of stick on the roster with some of these signings unless you actually are getting like a much bigger contract where you just know that you're not going to be kept at that tender. You have to let the undrafted guy walk. It means that Dortch is likely to be back for next year. He's obviously a huge fan favorite, which is great. I think that there is going to be some fans who felt like he would have done well in a full-time spot. And last year he got some of that chance to be able to start a bit more. But you kind of see he's not necessarily the greatest scheme fit for this 12-13 personnel type of offense that the Cardinals want to run. He's a guy that at 5'7" and 175 pounds, he'll be able to get open from the slot. He'll be a guy that you'll be able to see as a receiver, is able to make plays against some zone coverage, be able to get open some against man, but just hasn't seemed to be able to take the snaps in terms of a starting spot for one reason or another, and that blocking is probably a huge part of it. He still ends up finishing the season on a pretty big tear overall when you're talking about some of those recent games. Due to injuries to Michael Wilson down the stretch, he ended up with games of 3 of 3 for 60 yards against the Patriots. He ended up with going, I think it was 3 of 3 for 18 yards against the Rams, had one 19-yard catch, of course, against the Carolina Panthers in that overtime loss that sunk the Cardinals season. And he went off for 2 touchdowns because, of course, that's kind of what Greg Dortch does. You're like, all right, is this going to be a Greg Dortch game? And then you see the play run up in the red zone where he's like the guy in motion. You're like, yep, this is a Greg Dortch game. Something at least that I think is good is you are at least keeping someone who I think is a good football player. And that's something that can't be lost in Cardinals fans. Of you're also recognizing that it's not going to be the highest level of player. But that's why we want these type of players to be able to stick around, and then hopefully the Cardinals get to a spot where they'll have their own drafted guys, they'll be able to leave in free agency to get paid, and other guys are able to come back pretty quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I always so he's the type of person that I wish was more consistent. I've always kind of highly touted as Greg Dortch as possibly a good slot wide receiver that can, come in, have some big games for you, but that the big issue is like this inconsistency, unfortunately. And we were wondering
because of the size is a big part of that. Like he's going to be going up against some pretty big linebackers and safeties and stuff.
And he does do a good job at being able to separate. So that's his big strength is his ability to be able to separate, but maybe not finding the ball because of issues with the scheme. Maybe he's just attacking over the middle and it's hard to find him because he's also a small, wide receiver and whatnot. Maybe that's what's happening with him, but we see the highlights. So he has that ability to be able to make a cut and take it to the house. It's just not consistent enough.
Yep, no, it's just something like you said is like that's part of why we've talked about wide receiver as a potential need. So far, the Cardinals, they have not been able to really bring in or sign anyone outside of a special teams player. The Cardinals at least have been able to find someone to challenge some of the back end of their roster. This is probably like maybe it's going to be a guy who ends up on your practice squad, maybe a guy who ends up on the roster. Today, one of the guys that they brought in is a guy who played with Michael Wilson at Stanford. He is signed and is, I believe, only, I want to say, on a 1-year deal. Yep, that would be us. Simi Fihoko is his name. This is Darren Urban Cards Chatter announcing it. He's a special teamer wide receiver, but like played with Michael Wilson. You're just talking about like a depth special teams type of move. One that's not a special depth and teams types of move is going to be linebacker Akeem Davis Gaither. So this is someone who was a key special teamer for the Bengals, had a fantastic season, starting essentially in relief of some of the other players who are, I believe, hurt on the Bengals, and is a special team staple. But what we've seen with the Cardinals having Mac Wilson last year, they took a special teamer who started due to injury, promoted him to a full-time starter, and he was arguably the best free agent signing that the team had after Evan Brown of that whole season. When talking to a Bengals person who I've kind of talked with for a few years, whether in DMs or otherwise, and Joe Goodberry talked about him as an athletic, more hybrid linebacker who can play off the edge, sounds very similar to Mac Wilson, gained some size and strength. The biggest difference that he has is that while he can miss some tackles against the run, and like Kaiser White, we would always see would be like able to lock guys down against the run. He's better in coverage, so he's able to be fluid in movement. He's better in coverage, at least. He did grade out, I believe, for the Arizona, I think for the Bengals, as better in coverage than I believe it was. Let me find King Davis Gaither here. There you go. So you're talking about the overall coverage grades, not going to be in one of the highest level guys, but you're talking about having overall better coverage for what he was asked to do than the likes of a Mac Wilson, than even the likes of a Sean Murphy Bunting, and then from some of the other guys who play over in the edge. Kaiser White is no longer on the Cardinals. That's why he's not showing up, but he had a higher overall Pro Football Focus rating grade. We've argued about how some of those things can play out based on what they're asked to do. But for the most part, it ends up being that this is probably Arizona's Mike type of replacement that'll be able to add in at the linebacker core while letting some of their other guys like Kaiser White be able to walk. Chris Barnes, another huge name. Cardinals had not brought him back. Seems like they're getting a little bit more of an athletic upside guy, and he's a guy who made some pretty solid plays as well this last year. So when we're talking about Akeem Davis Gaither, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the top plays that he made just from this past year. So we're talking about, there's at least one play I know that he made this past year of melting into the window. You can see at least here that he actually just reads the guy's eyes and then drops in, gets a pick off of Patrick Mahomes, no less, in their first game. So you're talking about looking at him lined up, and it seems Marcos, I think, let's see if he's lined up with he's definitely with this being a 2 running back set. You've got the one heftier guy over there. So it looks like this is going to be probably more of like looking at the strong side out of this formation. He ends up kind of covering the guy out of the backfield. At least this is the check down Pat should take. He instead decides he's going to go and just toss the ball right overhead in the middle to Kelsey, just reads the quarterback's eyes, and knows that this is just a hook zone. Simple, I think, is what it is. Like, this is a spot where if you're the quarterback in Mahomes, best play is obviously just to take the check down right there, pick up a couple of yards. Context is key. Like, if it's 3rd and long versus it's something else, or was he just trying to take a shot play? Either way, one of the things that we've been able to see with Davis Gaither playing is that he did take a big step forward this past year. This is one of those tackles where we can say, as far as for with like being able to be a coverage guy, being able to stick along with the likes of I think this was Pat Fryermuth is the one who's making that catch there, being able to stay stride for stride with him. There's another great play that we have, at least, with him getting a deflection here. So there's going to be a deflection that Lamar Jackson throws. Davis Gaither, another interception that he got back in 2021. So you're talking about a guy who's played in backup duties, has had some interceptions and did good in coverage when he has been in there. But at the end of the day, Cardinals are going to be expecting him to probably take on a starting role. So that's something that will be interesting to watch. If they can take another guy who's been a long time special teams player back up and put him in as a starter, wouldn't shock me if Arizona is able to draft a linebacker at some point as well. And Owen Papo gets more snaps, Marcos.
Yeah, so I guess that's the idea, is just to get younger and have Owen Papo take one of the positions of either starter or be like the switch around competition backup role, whatever it is. And of course, you got Akeem Davis Gaither. They brought over. They want to give him at least a chance to be able to compete for that starting position. So they are definitely athletic on that part of the that part of the equation. I'm just interested in finding out if they're going to play him at the will or if they're going to have him as a Mike and see where they go off from there. Because I thought to myself that Mack Wilson was going to be the Mike linebacker for this team when they signed him last year, and this year that'd probably be the guy that you probably turn to and say, like, all right, you're going to be the one calling the defense. He plays a hybrid role as well, so it's the same thing they said about Mike Wilson. That's the same thing they said about Mack Wilson, is that you can have him rush the edge, or you can have him blitz over the middle and whatnot.
And that's going to be someone who, with that athleticism, you're also looking at how the Cardinals address linebacker. They like athletes. They don't like to pay a lot. This isn't like them going out and signing I think that the Niners had just saw one of their linebackers at least signed with the Colts. I believe his name is, it's escaping me. It's going to be, sorry, this is just the, I don't know why I'm drawing a blank here, at least for the most part. Anyway, the biggest thing that we can see, at least with being able to be a big free agent name as far as for the linebacker market and how that's looked for the NFL, the guys have gotten paid at least for the linebacker spot. Dre Greenlaw, that's the name. Dre Greenlaw. Ernest Jones got $11 million a year. Jamie and Sherwood, who is a guy that I know people talked about along with Robert Spillane, they signed for over about 35 and 45, so like 12 to $15 million a year. Cody Barton, who is another player at least that I thought was intriguing for Arizona at the inside linebacker spot, signed for about $7 million a year. King Davis Gaither's only on a 2-year deal, and he's only making about $6.5 million per year. So that's one of the things of why the market is changing, Marcos, where we're starting to see, hey, like linebackers are getting paid again, interior defensive linemen are getting paid. We're not seeing the same old NFL that we saw a few years ago. What we're seeing is teams are valuing interior pressure. We're seeing them value linebacker play, which means that running backs and stopping the run is in vogue now for defenses. That's something where the Cardinals have gone out and addressed some of these positions. And it's something we've talked about with how Arizona's biggest issue on the defensive side was not their secondary or their corners or even the safety and secondary tackling. It was being able to stop the run up the middle and then get pressure on the quarterback. They did not have edge rushers, did not have defensive linemen. If healthy now, obviously, is the disclaimer, but they now have addressed those spots on defense. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the remaining free agents as far as for guys who they could sign, guys who they probably will not go after, as well as a little bit around the NFL. So the one guy that the Cardinals, I believe, did have a meeting with was someone who is a familiar name to anyone who grew up like around my there. Yeah, exactly. Who grew up remembering that whole Philadelphia Eagles Andy Reid era. It's going to be really interesting to see how it goes because Asante Samuel Jr. visited. He's a guy who his first season looked like he was a lockdown corner. He actually was taking a few draft picks before the Cardinals back in, I believe it was the 2021 NFL draft. He went a couple of picks ahead of Rondale Moore, unless I'm mistaken. So the question, of course, is that he had a shoulder injury last year. They said that there was shoulder or stinger problems for years in early January, so it could be a chronic type of issue. This is a guy who's not going to be probably getting more than a 1-year deal if he signs with Arizona. He may not even be signed by Arizona, but this is one of those players where you're talking about a low risk, high reward. The risk that you have, of course, is that he may not be healthy to play, but that's why he's not going to be getting anything more than probably a 1-year deal. Was super talented, coming out about 5'10", 180 pounds. That's going to be one guy that we can watch. Who coming off of the Chargers, they chose to not re-sign him. That's a name that we could look at for Arizona as far as if there's another guy that they would bring in. Now let's go and talk about the rest of the 2025 free agents. And the thing we can't do, of course, is talk about that without going over some of the biggest NFL trades that have happened so far. The biggest trade, of course, being the one that sends Geno Smith from the Seattle Seahawks to get a new deal with the Las Vegas Raiders. They just take their offense last year that beat the Cardinals twice, no less, and he gets dealt, and he's going to be the starting quarterback for the Raiders. Raiders now don't have to trade up if they want for a quarterback. He seems like he's their guy for the next few years. Another name that we'll see traded is C.J. Gardner-Johnson goes from the Eagles to the Texans to help ensure up that secondary at the safety spot. They send back Kenyon Green, who was a first-round pick previously. Eagles deal away Kenny Pickett to the Browns. Browns are still probably holding on for Kirk Cousins' availability because that's a system, a Shanahan-style system that he knows. Pickett will probably be the backup, or if the Browns decide to take a quarterback at 2, whether or not the guy they want will be there, that's something to see. Texans, this is going to be interesting. Trade away Laramie Tunsil to the Washington Commanders. So you're talking about the Commanders and then also trading for Deebo Samuel. Kind of unique that they traded for 2 offensive veterans because it matches, Marcos, when Cliff Kingsbury is with the Cardinals. They also made trades for offensive guys. They made a trade for Hollywood Brown, costing a first, a second for DeAndre Hopkins, and a third for Rodney Hudson. So we'll see exactly if that turns out for the Commanders, who had made the NFC Championship game last year. We already talked a bit about the Christian Kirk, if that was going to be a fit for the Cardinals. He actually gets traded versus outright released. And the Bears trade for a couple of other players. The big one that we're seeing is that DK Metcalf gets traded away from the Seattle Seahawks. The Seahawks also cut Tyler Lockett. Seahawks have then gone and made a couple of other huge moves as well. So when we're talking about huge moves, the biggest move that we've seen in the division outside of Matt Stafford re-upping on a new contract is Sam Darnold gets signed now to a 3-year, $100 million deal from the Seattle Seahawks. It's a little bit of the same sort of price that Geno Smith had. He had a fantastic season last year with the Minnesota Vikings with Kevin O'Connell, Justin Jefferson. This is a move that I don't really like that much, Marcos. I felt like that the best move for Seattle would have been to pay Geno Smith his money, line yourself up with some extra draft picks for next year's quarterback class. Maybe even this year, if you think you like a Shadur Sanders enough and think that he can be your new Geno, maybe you've got the opportunity to get him. Instead, they take three of their biggest players on offense and release them and bring in Sam Darnold. And as of today, about a couple hours ago, they have signed Cooper Kupp of the Los Angeles Rams. He has had his PFF grade decline quite a bit over the last couple of years, as well as his overall play on the field. One of the things that's really strange with Kupp, as far as if we're looking at the stats each season for him, is that he's just declined ever since that Super Bowl season when it comes to his overall season-long grades. He still has been a solid player overall, but when you're talking about the elite caliber player that he was, he's gone down each year and has had a increase in terms of his ability to separate. That ended in 2021. He's had less separation and even less yards over the last few years, hasn't stayed as healthy. I don't know what the Seahawks are doing, Marcos, but as a Cardinals fan, I'll play the tiniest violin in the world for them if this move works out. Good for them. They'll be able to get younger and a bit cheaper outside of that, but it feels a lot like they went and signed a veteran and a bunch of slot guys. I will say, or at least a slot guy to pair with Jackson Smith and Jigba. They don't have the best offensive line as it stands currently. That's really going to be tough for me to be able to see the Seahawks when it comes to that team. Can they take a step forward on what they were on offense? Because it feels like they're going to be maybe taking a step back in terms of losing a DK Metcalf, adding in a Cooper Kupp, adding a Marquez Valdez-Scantling, who can be a great deep threat with Clint Kubiak, but also has had some drop issues. If you're a Cardinals fan, you're probably looking at this saying, hey, Geno beat us twice last year. The Cardinals should have probably beaten Sam Darnold last year. Let's see what Sam looks like outside of the Vikings anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we definitely are going to see, because we're in their division, so we're going to see how he does against us 2 times a year at home and away. But I thought that was an interesting move to sign Sam Darnold and then just trade away the guy who was quarterbacking your team into at least some rep. He didn't allow Geno Smith didn't allow the Seahawks to be in the drums or at the bottom and stuff. And that's what kind of sucks, because we thought that season that Geno Smith was going to be the starter. They were just going to be the worst team in the league and whatnot, or at least in our division. Oh boy, were we wrong, but that is an interesting move in my opinion.
Oh, yeah, for sure. The other ones around the division, we can talk a little bit about the Rams. The Rams at least went and signed Devontae Adams to a 2-year deal. He is now separate from Aaron Rodgers for only the second time in his career, although Jimmy Garoppolo, the backup for the Rams, is back with him. That was the guy who kept throwing him a little bit of overthrows back on the Raiders. So now you're talking about Puka Nacua, who's going to be your slot guy who kind of had replaced Cooper Kupp. You got Devontae Adams now, who still has been able to separate and make plays outside as the X-receiver. We got to see him have a decent job against the Cardinals when they played the Jets this year. This is a good team-building move. Can't deny it. The Rams bring back Matthew Stafford. Despite him being older, you see his talent last year as he gets the Rams to the playoffs, gets them essentially one drive away from having an opportunity to go to the NFC Championship game. And yeah, it's just something where there's good teams making good moves to be able to continue. It's going to be a hard cover for the Arizona Cardinals with the Rams upgrades on defense, now having 2 great targets on the offensive side of the ball. It's one of those places where right now the Rams are still the favorites. That's something that you can't really argue in terms of how the rest of the division is shaped, and that's going to be your biggest threat. The Cardinals did almost beat the Rams last year, outside of that throw with Kyler and Trey McBride that ended up being on the helmet versus, remember how that went. It's going to be kind of a slobber knocker every time you play the Rams, and I think that we'll see this year with the Cardinals exactly how that plays out. As far as what we've seen with the 49ers and their free agency tracker, they've lost quite a few guys. 49ers have kind of gone into this year, and it seems like whether they're going to be paying Brock Purdy the money he wants, whether Brock Purdy's going to get into a contract dispute like we saw with Brandon Ayuk last year, Niners have moved on from quite a few players. The fullback, Kyle Juszczyk, they've moved on from. He was released. They traded away Deebo Samuel. Dre Greenlaw and Talonoa Hufunga signed. Charvarius Ward had been one of the few cornerbacks who, when he signed in free agency, lived up to that deal as being like that shutdown type number one corner with the Niners. Jalen Moore signed with a deal with Kansas City to kind of be one of their left tackles. And then Joshua Dobbs left for New England, which really funny is you look at about a couple of years ago, I think it was last year, actually. Jacoby Brissett was the backup in New England. 2 years ago, Josh Dobbs was the backup for the Cardinals. They've effectively switched quarterbacks. They've also lost their starting left guard. They released Javon Hargrave. You're like, this is about 25 of the 41 players in last year's snaps are not on their roster anymore. They bring in Luke Farrell, who's going to be kind of running one of that two personnel. So we talk about Kyle Juszczyk, fullback on the field. That's a 22 personnel look. They'll probably shift to more 12 personnel with George Kittle and having a better blocking and receiving threat in Luke Farrell. Kind of how the Cardinals have had with Trey McBride being that main George Kittle type and then being able to have that number 2 tight end that they drafted last year, was the athletic freak being essentially their main blocking tight end. So, Marcos, if I'm a Cardinals fan, here's what I'm seeing free agency. Rams didn't get worse. They got a bit better, maybe a lot better, depending on how things shake out with the difference between Devontae Adams and Cooper Kupp. Seahawks, man, I got no idea. Like, if anything, I would say that they probably took a slight step down from Geno, got a bit younger. That defense has been pretty good overall, but they got to figure out their offensive line. We'll see how that works with Clint Kubiak as the new offensive coordinator. And we also have seen, as far as with guys with the Niners, yeah, they've lost tons of guys this year. They've made very few approaches and changes in free agency. So if you're an Arizona Cardinals fan, Marcos, you're probably at least looking at this team saying, all right, guys, you may not be able to beat the Rams. If the Seahawks thing ends up imploding a bit, this is your opportunity if you're a Cardinals fan. Try to see if you make that push for being number 1 or number 2 in the NFC West. And this is all, of course, before getting a 16th overall pick pulled in. I'm very curious to see exactly how these teams will look entering the year because, Marcos, last year the Cardinals, they had the opportunity to take the NFC West. It seemed like the bottom fell out in the second half of the season. They had a shot to still be able to win the division by beating the Panthers and the Rams. They lost both of those games close. This is really your time if you're Arizona, Monty Austin-Ford, and Kyler Murray to be able to kind of put as much as you can together to get this team to the postseason and see just what kind of damage they can do with K1.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to run through the Los Angeles Rams for sure. And just considering how last year started, I thought the Rams were going to be the worst team in the NFC West, and it just came back down. Like it was just crazy how they made that run. And because they were able to restock on defensive like help and whatnot, Braden Fisk and Jared Verse, those two rookies themselves developing and being the stalwarts that they are, just kind of retool their defense and whatnot. So like I said, and I'm sorry about that. And like I said, it's going to go through the Los Angeles Rams. They're going to be the guys that we need to beat. And the Cardinals, they kind of close that gap, or if anything, hopefully surpass that with the addition of the defensive players that we added to our roster and whatnot. So, I mean, we almost beat them last year. We beat them bad at the beginning of the season, and we almost beat them last year. So we're not too far away from where they're standing at and stuff. And I do think that the Seahawks kind of stayed the same. And I think the 49ers they're just crashing down. They need to get a rebuild going.
Yep, they'll have a top 11 pick or a top 12 pick, I believe, at least. So that'll be something that will help with the Niners as they kind of get this reset going. But yeah, it definitely feels like that's the end of an era of the Niners just essentially being the top team or even getting hurt and running it back the following season. Let's wrap up our show with a little bit, and we'll have a little bit more insight into this the next time, of course. But with this year and the NFL Combine, we have a bunch of guys who didn't participate in the workouts. Less guys, it seems like, are using the Combine and more having the Pro Bowl to control their narrative. Some athletic running backs ended up showing up. The Ohio State guys have just not really done as much with the drills. You got to see the running back is probably not going to be the biggest need for the Cardinals this year. Although when it comes to a guy who at least really did show up pretty well in terms of the running back spot, that will have relevance for people is Cam Scadaboo exploding with a almost 40-inch vertical. He also had, as far as a broad jump, finished up there in terms, I think it was a 10 foot, what was it, 10 foot 3 inches? Yep, so finished up high in terms of the explosive drills. And then when it came to some of the ones, only a couple of guys around the 3-cone, which is one of my favorite things to look at for running backs. But it is something, at least, that when we can talk about how the team needs and who would stack up, you look at who are the guys who were in the first round, guys who could stack up in terms of other rounds. This is a deep running back class with some of these different guys. You can at least see there's a ton of speed this year. Receivers, not as good as last year. I don't think there's a single receiver that's in this year's NFL draft that you take over Marvin Harrison Jr., you take over Malik Neighbors, or that you take over who the Bears drafted last year. Oh gosh, why can't I remember these names sometimes? Rome Odunze. There it was. Yeah, Rome wasn't built in a day. There's still some good players this year, at least 1 or 2 first round guys, but wide receiver, probably not going to be a huge need in the Cardinals for the first round. We'll see if they still bring in a veteran on offense or not. Looking at the tight end spot, it feels like the Cardinals are pretty set at tight end as well. Maybe you get a late round pick who can be a little bit more of a blocking and receiving threat. The ones as far as on offense that really is interesting is the offensive tackle spot, Marcos. Now, I don't know how many tackles are going to be there when it comes to the draft, but when you look at how the Cardinals have built their team, they got Kelvin Beachum on a 1-year deal. This is the last year of Jonah Williams' deal. They re-signed Evan Brown. If you were going to say draft a guy and play him at right guard for a year and then move him out to right tackle, or even say, hey, Jonah Williams, like, we love you, buddy. We love this tackle. We're going to move you into right guard, potentially even as far as the season if we need to. He's getting paid enough money that I don't think they would do that. That would be maybe a last-ditch effort. But there's some pretty good offensive tackles in this year's draft, Marcos. One of the biggest ones that we'll see fly off the board in the top 10 picks now is Armand Membo. He had a 4.9 second 40-yard dash, second fastest of all, at 332 pounds, which is crazy. He's probably going to end up getting lined up at tackle, is what it seems like. You had a guy like a Josh Connerly at Oregon lined up and did really well as well. Kelvin Banks Jr. tested out to be pretty good. Will Campbell seems like he'll end up being, if not a starting caliber tackle, he'll probably be a great guard. Tyler Booker is a guy who probably tested out of the Arizona Cardinals in terms of athleticism. The best comparison for him is the Bruce Arians Mike Iupati, a guy who just can stand there and move guys out of the way. But the Cardinals love guys who can pull, who can run some of the different gap schemes. You're able to see the counter, guard tackle counter is their biggest play. Booker did not seem to indicate that he had the same level of athleticism, and I think that's going to be a huge thing for Arizona. As far as the rest, when it comes down for long-term center, it does feel like the Cardinals are content to just go with what their center spot is for the most part. On the defensive side of the ball, we're talking about the interior linemen. So Mason Graham is a name that people have seen going in the top end of the Arizona Cardinals mock draft as far as for wants and needs. Kenneth Grant has been up there. They didn't participate. Walter Nolan, a guy who's had some character questions that most people haven't heard exactly what it is, did not run and test out there either. We did see an athletic freak show of Tyleik Williams because he didn't test but had a huge amount of college production, and he nailed every single drill. So didn't do any testing but did all the drills. He looked so fluid. Like, it's one of those places where when you're talking about one of those guys who's going to be a first round player that like could end up being a high upside sort of guy, getting him in would be an awesome fit. He's also a Ohio State defensive lineman. Derek Harmon is a guy out of Oregon, also did fantastic. That's a name that I haven't seen mocked enough to the Arizona Cardinals. If you're going to be looking at a first round defensive lineman, and the Darius Alexander was similar to last year's Darius Robinson with production and everything, this is all something that's awesome news, Marcos, because it showed that in terms of the Cardinals' needs being an edge rusher, a defensive lineman on that defensive side, you got plenty of picks that you can go from here.
Yeah, but we've got a lot of picks, but I mean, I'm definitely going to be paying attention to the edge rushers and that interior, just like we just talked about and stuff. I really hope that for the first time in Monty Osborne's, tenure here, that he does go defense in the first round, because there have been like talked about like maybe tackle being taken
Mhm.
as the first round pick and whatnot. I think we need to kind of steer clear from the offense just for the moment, because if we are going to try to compete and whatnot, we need to go with what the Eagles game plan was. And they drafted defensive help, and they drafted them high in a number, so now they're young and they got themselves a core as a defense that ultimately, what's the difference against the Kansas City Chiefs?
Yeah, exactly. Everyone's going after these defensive linemen, getting that chance to stop the run, make plays on the quarterback from the interior. On the outside or from the edge, James Pierce had he had a really poor vertical jump and then ran a 4 point for a second 40. As far as with speed off the edge, he's got it. He's one of the players that people have wanted for the Cardinals. I've cooled quite a bit on him, and I'll get into more of that in a future podcast for the most part. But a lot of the guys who were going to be the top edge rushers did not run or didn't test. The ones that did, who really popped, were going to be a Donovan Aziri Aku, I believe is his name. He showed up as far as like huge athleticism, which I'm very excited for. I think that with the Cardinals, that would be a name that if there's one that they could end up picking that people aren't expecting, that may be one of them right there. Jack Sawyer is a name that some people had wondered about in the second round. He just didn't test as well as far as with any sort of the athleticism. He's probably that guy who ends up being like a Dennis Gardeck 2.0, where he gets drafted on day 3, quality special teams guy, special teams captain, huge player, and then just gets effort sacks. Like he'll have a 10 sack season every once in a while because of just the pure effort. The guy who really blew the combine out of the water was Shamar Stewart. And Shamar Stewart ultimately ended up really testing into a weird category, because Shamar Stewart, as far as the combine would go, he absolutely destroyed the combine. But when it came to his production, he never had more than a 1.5 sacks in a season. Like, this is pretty crazy. So you're talking about, this is a guy who has ultimately huge explosiveness. He ran a 4.5 40, huge split, 40-inch vertical jump, huge broad, didn't run the 3-cone, but he just was flying all over the field. You can see the explosiveness on the tape, and he had 1.5 sacks a season in college. You're wondering, was that the coordinator, one of the other issues? It seems like he's probably going to be testing and now going ahead of where the Cardinals would be picking in the draft, just because of that upside with the combine result. Let's wrap up by talking a little bit more about just some of the other players. Jihad Campbell is a guy who came in with basically a built-in-a-lab type of player. If Isaiah Simmons was built in a lab, this is a guy who was built in a lab as a pure linebacker who can then also rush the passer. So you're talking about, if you give a mega Mario mega mushroom to someone like that, the closest that I can think of being like how a Darrell Washington, if he was a better athlete, is kind of the closest that you'll see there. Very versatile. Nick Martin from Oklahoma State tested well. There also was another guy that is Ohio State linebacker who also is part of the NFL. He didn't test. I believe it's Cody Simon is his name. He's a linebacker that didn't test, but will probably show up pretty well. If he hits the athleticism scores that we expect and the fit with Ohio State players and the Arizona Cardinals, that would be a name I'd watch out for on potentially day 2 or day 3. And then there's another linebacker who wasn't mentioned as much, who was there for UCLA, as well as I think his name is a inside linebacker draft. Sorry, I'm pulling this as we just end our show here today for the last couple of highlights. Carson Schweschinger is his name. He could go as early as the first round, tested out as just great NFL combine showing that he had overall. He could be the first round linebacker who goes in now that linebackers are getting paid again. That's something that I could see, and I'm not seeing what his statistics were, unfortunately. But that would be a name if he falls to round 2 and the Cardinals say, "Hey, we're going to actually take an athletic linebacker and spend a pick on a linebacker." that would be a name that I think you can watch if you're a fan. When it comes to the other pieces that are there, Maxwell Hairston was the guy who had a 4.2840. He made himself some money, had a really great complete performance. I don't think he's going to test into that number 16 spot for the Arizona Cardinals. There's another guy that I think could end up falling up there in terms of being a first rounder. The Malachi Starks was the other one. Cardinals seem set on safeties, at least for right now. And with how some of these safeties have been paid, I don't think that you're going to end up seeing any sort of cornerback or safety. Maybe a corner would go soon, but I think it would definitely be what was his name at least again for that NFL cornerback rankings. If you're going to see a guy who goes in there, it'd be a corner at 16 and then maybe not for a while, because this is a heavy defensive line class, heavy running back class, and even a decent edge class. Marcos, any thoughts you have before we wrap up today, and any last things before we dig into a real kind of combine deep look and our mock drafts next podcast?
Just final thoughts. I'm liking the direction the free agency is going. It's really going to set us up really well for the draft. And of course, within the next month, the mock drafts are going to come out. The highlights are going to come out. The study deep dive and everything is going to come out and whatnot. We're going to have our basically, this guy is going to be mocked at 16th, and we're going to try our best to try to get him and whatnot, or what ideas can we get? Should we trade back? Should we trade forward? Just all the craziness that comes with it.
Yeah, it'd be one thing that I would say is a sleeper name that would be a pick that's not at an offensive line spot, not at a defensive line spot, not an edge rusher. Keep an eye on Will Johnson if he gets there to 16. If there's a huge run on all of those other positions and he had the best player on the board, that'd be a sleeper spot for the Cardinals to add it to. It's already a strong secondary. Let's go with some of our comments, at least, that we have for the most part, just talking about some of the other areas. We're talking about with Cam Scadaboo is not going to be part of the Big 12 Pro Day. Big 12 is having all of their guys together for a pro day. He's not going to be participating in that. He will do some private workouts for teams. He's not going to probably run the fastest 40. If he runs a 4.58 or a 4.6 at his size, it's going to be a bit slower. That's something where he doesn't probably going to go into round 2 because of the speed issues. But he's probably going to test out relatively well in everything else for the explosiveness. A smaller version of James Conner is a good way that I like to think about him. As far as with the ability for the Cardinals to take him, some info I can at least give is that out of the big 3 in the Arizona Cardinals, there's going to be some guys who are going to be super high on him in terms of really liking Cam Scadaboo. There's going to be some other guys who are not quite as high on him. One of the people I think, at least around there, I'll say rhymes a little bit with Tidwell, may not be as high on Scadaboo, but pay attention to how the rumor mill flows after he has that official visit with the Cardinals that's coming up. He's going to get an official top 30 visit, so taking some extra time. That's one of the names I know a lot of Cardinals fans have talked to me saying, are they actually going to go after or get him? That's something that we'll have to be able to see. As well as talking with Booker, going to a specific scheme as well from Dana R. Obviously, that's not going to be the Cardinals scheme. That's something that we have at least to know for sure. And then, of course, with Monty Austin-Fork, they've got their max value in mind. They want to get multi-year deals for these guys. They don't want to do these 4-year deals unless they're capturing star players. At the end of the day, I think, Marcos, what we can say is that this has been a successful free agency for the Cardinals. But remember, whoever wins in free agency doesn't always win the Super Bowl. Just one of those things you have to be able to be aware of. And we'll be covering all of that here on the Redbird Reboot. Before we log out, Marcos, can you shout out where our viewers and podcast listeners can find you?
Big Soul, and of course on the Redbird Reboot podcast here on YouTube.
And you can find me at Blake Murphy 7. That's at Pancake Soul. This has been the Redbird Reboot podcast. Cardinals have attacked free agency. They actually have rebooted their team enough to fill a lot of these gaps in free agency. That means it's time for us to log off for now. We'll see you guys on the other side, and go Cardinals.